So we are doing the MyiMaths exercise on direct and inverse proportion, and I'm looking at question 1, which concerns direct proportion. The first question says y is proportional to x. So what that means is y is equal to some number times x, and we've got to figure out that number, and for the purposes of that we're going to just call that number k. Could have been any letter, but k tends to be used. And oh, my computer seems to be offline. Hopefully that'll fix itself. And it says y is 63 when x is 7. So we can fill in those values. Y is 63 when x equals 7. So in other words, 63 is equal to k times x. And we can divide both sides of that by 7 to get k on its own. 63 divided by 7 is 9. So we can deduce that k in this case is 9. So I'm going to go back to the original thing I wrote and replace the k with a 9. And now we know that the relationship between x and y is that y equals 9 times x. And that's certainly borne out when we look at the table. 63 is 9 times 7, so that all figures. And then we've got to complete the rest of the table. So when x is 13, what is y? Okay, well, we know that y is 9 times x, so y equals 9 times 13 in this case, which is 117. So I'll just fill in 117 there. And then we've got to figure out what x is if y is 153. So again, I'll just replace the y with 153. 153 equals 9 times x, and we've got to figure out what x is. So we want to get x on its own. We want to divide everything by 9 left and right. So x is 153 divided by 9, which I'm just trying to do in my head as we go along. It does go exactly. It's 19, isn't it? No, it's not 19. It's 17. That's what it is, 17. 17 is equal to x. So I'll just fill in 17 in the thing there and move on to the next question. So in the next question we've got two variables, b and a, and it says b is proportional to a squared. So we've got two things going on, b and a squared, and because they're proportional it means that the one thing equals some constant that we're going to call k for the purposes of this times a squared. So b equals a squared, and we've got the information in the question that b is 192 when a equals 8. So putting those numbers in, 192 equals k times 8 squared. Well, 8 squared is 64, so 192 equals 64 times k. And then I want to get the k bit on its own, so I need to divide by 64, and that does go exactly. If we divide both sides by 64, we get that k is equal to 3. So now that I've figured out that k is 3, I can just go back to the original relationship that I wrote down, and I figured out that that k is 3. So the relationship between a and b is that b equals 3a squared. Well, now that I've done that, I can fill out the table. I need to know what b is when a is 19. So b equals 3 times 19 squared. 19 squared is 19 times 19, which is 361, I hope. So b equals 3 times 361, which is, gosh, this is testing my mental arithmetic late at night. 1083, I hope. So I'll just fill that in on the table. 1083. Okay, then we've got to figure out what A is when B equals 363. So again, just fill in the numbers that we know. 363 is B, and we've got to figure out what A is. So just replacing the B with 363, we get 363 equals 3A squared. I'd like to get the A squared bit on its own, so I'm going to divide everything by 3, and that gives me 121 equals A squared. So A has got to be the square root of 121, and that's looking promising because we know that's going to come out to exactly 11. That's a nice round number, so it seems like it might be a reasonable answer, given that these questions tend to be constructed in such a way that often constructed in such a way that the answers come out nicely. Okay, the next one, Q is proportional to P cubed. So we've got two things going on, Q and P cubed, and because they're proportional, Q is equal to some constant that we've got to figure out times P cubed, and we're going to call that constant K as usual. We've got the information that Q is 16 when P equals 2. So 16 equals K times 2 cubed. 2 cubed is just 8. 2 times 2 times 2. So 16 is equal to 8 times K, and divide everything by 8. K is equal to 2. So having figured out that K is equal to 2, I can go back to my original relationship between Q and P that I wrote down and replace the K with the 2 that we figured it out to be. So I'll get rid of all of that, and the next job is to fill out the gaps in the table. We want to know what Q is when P is 5. So Q equals 2 times 5 cubed if P is 5. Q equals 2 times 5 times 5 times 5 is 125. So Q equals 2 times 125, which is 250. So let's fill that in. 250. And the next one, we need to figure out what P is if Q is 1458. Yuck. Hopefully this has been designed to be a nice round answer, but let's go through it. 1458 is equal to 2p cubed. I'd like to get the p cubed bit on its own because I'm trying to figure out what p is. So I'm going to divide everything by 2. So I've got to do the same the other side, and that gives me 729. 729 is p cubed. So p itself is going to be the cube root of 729. So that's something I can do on a calculator, but I happen to have spotted that that's a nice cube number. 9 times 9 times 9 makes 729, so p is 9, the cube root of 729, which you can easily do on a calculator. So I'll put in 9 there. And on to the last question of page 1. N is proportional to the square root of m. Okay, so we've got two things going on, n and the square root of m, and they are proportional, which means that one thing equals some constant that we're going to call k for the purposes of this, times the other thing, and we've got to try and figure out what that k is equal to. we've got some information. N equals 80 when m equals 64. So we'll stick those numbers in. N equals 80 when m equals 64. So 80 is equal to k, that we've got to figure out, times the square root of 64. Well, that's looking very promising, because the square root of 64 is a nice round 8. So 80 is equal to 8 times k. And dividing everything by 8, k has got to be 10. So 10 is equal to k. And now that we figured out that k is 10, we can go back to the original relationship that we wrote down between n and m and replace that k with a 10. N equals 10 times the square root of m. So now we figured out the relationship, we can fill in the gaps in the table. M equals 144, figure out what n is. Okay, so n equals 10 times the square root of 144. N equals 10 times, well, that's a nice easy 12. N equals 10 times 12, which is 120. So fill in 120. And then the very last one, when n equals 300, got to figure out what m is equal to. Okay, so there's the relationship between the two things. N equals 10 times the square root of m. We've got n equal to 300, so 300 equals 10 times the square root of m. I'd quite like to get this square root of m on its own, so I'm going to divide everything by 10 and get the square root of m on its own is equal to 30. And then what I'm going to do now is square both sides. Square both sides. So instead of the square root of m, I get a whole m. But I've got to square the other side as well. So I've got to multiply through 30 by itself, and that gives me 900. So multiplying each side by itself, or squaring it, I get m is equal to 900. And I'll fill that in on the table, 900. And then the last thing that remains to be done is to mark it, so let's do that. And hopefully, there we are, 8 out of 8.